Today we're going to cover Chapter 15, Differential Reinforcement. Now in the previous chapter, in Chapter 14, we talked about using extinction to decrease undesirable behaviors. In this chapter, we're going to actually combine extinction with that idea of reinforcement that we've talked about quite a bit already in this course, and using both reinforcement and extinction together to try and decrease undesirable behaviors and increase desirable behaviors. And we're going to do this through the process of differential reinforcement. So we can start off with our definition of differential reinforcement, where it is an operant training procedure in which some of our behaviors are going to be systematically reinforced and others are not. So that combination of reinforcement and extinction together. So the desirable behaviors will be reinforced and the undesirable behaviors will go through extinction. And that combination will get an increase overall of our desirable behaviors and a decrease in the occurrence of the undesirable behaviors. And so we're going to talk about 4 broad categories of differential reinforcement. Now, I'm going to go over these in a slightly different order than the textbook, and I'm also going to include instead of just talking about low rates for the first one that we're going to talk about, I'm going to include high rates, which aren't explicitly stated in the textbook, but are sort of a logical extension of our low rates. So once we get there, you'll see what I'm talking about. But if you're following along in the textbook, my lecture slides aren't going to match up exactly. We're going to talk about stuff in a slightly different order, just so that you're braced. But for our roadmap, we're going to talk first about differential reinforcement of low rates, or DRL. Then we'll talk about differential reinforcement of high rates, DRH, which, as you can imagine, is going to be sort of the opposite, very similarly related to low rate differential reinforcement, but for the opposite. Then we'll talk about differential reinforcement of other behaviors, or DRO, and then differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, or DRA. So that's what we're going to cover today. So let's start off with our differential reinforcement of low rate, or DRL. So the basic idea behind a DRL is that our behavior is only going to be reinforced if it occurs no more than a specified number of times in a given period. Basically, you're going to set an upper limit as to the number of times a behavior can occur, and if the individual who this DRL is being applied to doesn't exceed that maximum limit, then they receive reinforcement. The important thing to note here is that we're not trying to completely eliminate a behavior. What we're trying to do is reduce the amount of times that this behavior is going to be occurring. So we want to get lower rates of responding, or lower rates of this behavior. So this is often seen in cases where the behavior itself isn't necessarily a problem behavior. It's only a problem behavior because it's occurring at such high rates. So you can use a DRL to get those rates back down lower so that it's no longer a problem. And so we can think about this in terms of, say, a pigeon in an operant box. And if we were using a differential reinforcement of low rates of responding for that pigeon in that operant box, we might say that we're going to reinforce the pigeon for pecking only after 5 seconds have elapsed since the last peck. So we want there to be at least 5 seconds with no pecking before this pigeon gets reinforced for pecking. So each time they peck, it's going to restart that 5-second clock. And if it's been, say, 2 seconds since they last pecked, they're not going to receive reinforcement. But if they peck at 5 seconds or 6 seconds, if they can wait at least 5 seconds before they peck again, then we're going to get them reinforcement, in this case in the form of food. There are 2 distinct types of DRLs that are both fairly closely related, but are basically just framing the situation slightly differently. So we can talk about a full session DRL, which is closer to the original definition that I gave here, which is saying that If a behavior doesn't happen in a particular interval of time, or say within a full session that's being looked at, then reinforcement can be given. So an example of that would be that reinforcement would be delivered if, say, a child was told that they can only raise their hand in class 3 times. And during that period of class, maybe they only raise their hand twice. So at the end of the class, they would then receive the agreed upon reinforcement. The second type of DRL is a spaced responding DRL, and this lines up just a little bit more with our example with the pigeon and pecking. So for that spaced responding DRL, we're saying that there must be a specified amount of time that passes before or between responses before a reinforcer can be delivered. For our example of a child putting their hand up in class a certain number of times, we could apply this spaced responding DRL idea to say that maybe the teacher won't call on the child before a 15-minute interval has elapsed. So even if they put their hand up, they're not going to get reinforcement, i.e. the attention of being able to answer the question, until a certain amount of time has elapsed. So both of these are trying to reduce the amounts of times that behavior is occurring in an amount of time. One is just sort of focusing on reducing the overall amount of times the behavior happens, and the other is trying to space that behavior out throughout a specific set interval. But both of these are going to result in lower rates of responding. And as we establish this procedure, as the individual who's undergoing this differential reinforcement process, as they're getting used to the process, we can extend these intervals. So we can have longer and longer intervals to produce even lower rates over time. So at the very beginning, you want to reduce it a little bit, but as you get those slight reductions, you want to continue that process until you reach a desirable level of that behavior so that it's no longer a problem. There is some concern that this procedure might produce superstitious behavior because they're not receiving reinforcement for the behavior that they might have previously been reinforced for, so they might try and find other behaviors to obtain that reinforcement, but that doesn't always happen. But this can be a useful method for reducing the rates of problem behaviors, especially if you're not trying to eliminate them, just trying to reduce them. All right, so how do we actually use a DRL? So the first step is to actually figure out if this is the correct procedure to use. So you want to decrease a behavior but not eliminate it entirely. Your second step is to figure out what is your definition of an acceptable level of the behavior. How much of a reduction do you want to see? What is your maximum occurrence of this behavior in a unit time? Step 3 is to decide which kind of DRL you want to implement. Do you want that full session DRL or do you want a spaced responding DRL? So you can figure this out by asking yourself, do we want to reduce the rate of that behavior occurring overall? Do we want to bring down that occurrence like sort of en masse? Or are we just trying to space it out? So if we were looking at something like a child that eats too quickly, we don't necessarily want to stop them from eating. We just want them to slow down and space out the number of mouthfuls of food that they take. So you wouldn't necessarily want a full session DRL in that instance because we don't want to reduce the number of bites that they take of their food. What we want instead is for them to space out their bites of food. So we would use a spaced responding DRL. So if we want to reduce the overall occurrence of a behavior, then we would go full session. And if we just want to space it out over time, if we want to slow it down, then that spaced responding works better. Step 4 is to inform the client about the procedure and the criterion for reinforcement. Now, this isn't always possible. Sometimes you're trying to implement this in, say, organisms that don't understand instructions. So whether you're trying to use it on a pigeon or maybe someone who's nonverbal in terms of they can't understand instructions that are given to them or something like that. So if at all possible, you'd want to explain the procedure and what they need to do for reinforcement if that's something that could help in this situation. And then our last step is to provide feedback on performance. Again, if possible, let them know how they're doing and what you're going to be doing sort of going forward. So if they've done really well, then maybe tell them they're doing really well. If you're going to start adjusting the procedure, maybe you want to further reduce the behavior, or maybe you've obtained the results you were looking for. You want to let the individual know what's going on if you can. Our next point is that differential reinforcement of high rates. This is, as I said before, basically the opposite of our DRL. So a DRH is when a behavior is reinforced only if it occurs at least a certain number of times in a given period. So the goal here would be to increase rates of behavior rather than decrease. So we're trying to get very high rates of responding, and we're doing this by reinforcing that behavior, or reinforcing that individual for a particular behavior only if the behavior occurs as much or more than a set criterion. So we could say that we could reinforce pigeons pecking only if it is pecked at least 5 times within 10 seconds. If it's responded less than 5 times in that 10-second interval, then they don't receive reinforcement. And then we would reset the clock for the next 10-second interval. So, like I said, the opposite of our DRL, with the goal of increasing our rates of behavior. Next, we're going to talk about differential reinforcement of other behavior, or DRO. Now, this name can be a little bit misleading because it seems to specify some other behavior, but what it's really saying is that our reinforcement is going to be contingent on a complete absence of our problem behavior for a period of time. And as a result, we're going to reinforce them basically doing anything but the problem behavior. You can sometimes see this called differential reinforcement of zero responding, and it's because we're looking for a lack of that defined behavior. So a lack of the problem behavior, or the lack of whatever it is we're trying to reduce. So with our example of a pigeon pecking, in a DRO, we would say that we'd reinforce the pigeon only after 10 seconds have elapsed with no pecking. So if they don't peck for 10 seconds, then they get reinforcement. If the behavior does occur, if they do peck, then that 10-second clock resets and starts over again. Now, during that 10 seconds, we're saying specifically the pigeon cannot peck. But we're not saying what they have to do instead. We're saying that they can do literally anything else as long as they're not pecking. So if they go and get food from somewhere else, if they get water, if they sit in the corner, if they scratch at the ground, all of that is fine as long as they don't do the one behavior that we've defined as them not being able to do. Now, clearly this is not the same as our DRL. Our DRL was trying to reduce the rates of behavior. A DRO is trying to completely eliminate this behavior. So we're trying to get down to this behavior not occurring at all. The example used in the textbook for this is that there's a child whose problem behavior was sucking their thumb. And so what the parent did to try and get them out of this behavior was use stories, reading stories to them, say at bedtime, as the reinforcer. And they would stop reading whenever the child sucked their thumb. But if the child stopped sucking their thumb, if they stopped doing the target or bad behavior, then they would resume reading the story. So we were here in that situation receiving reinforcement for doing anything other than the one behavior that we're trying to avoid. So the child could do anything else except sucking their thumb, and the parent would continue reading the story. But as soon as the child starts sucking their thumb again, the parent would stop reading the story, they'd remove that reinforcement, and then the hope would be that over time the child would suck their thumb less and less to hear more and more of the story. This DRO procedure is especially helpful in situations where extinction alone isn't an option. So with thumb sucking, maybe that action itself is soothing. And so you can't really use extinction on that because the process of sucking their thumb is itself reinforcing. So what we're doing is providing reinforcement for something else. So they get that story read to them if they do another behavior, which is any other behavior other than sucking their thumb. So that's why this is a good procedure for situations like that. And following our same layout that we used with the previous option, we can talk about how we could actually use a DRO. So step one is, of course, we want to figure out, like, what are we doing? Define our target behavior. What do we want to increase or decrease? Because we don't have a set behavior to increase, we're just saying that they can do anything other than that bad behavior. We're going to focus on what we're decreasing. So we're going to define our bad behavior or our problem behavior, the thing that we want to decrease. And by having a nice solid definition of that behavior, we can then differentiate it from other behaviors. And we could also use that definition to monitor it, to look at sort of before and after data to see if our DRO was actually effective. Our next step is to choose a reinforcer. What are we going to do to reinforce that behavior? For the child who was sucking their thumb, they enjoyed having a story read to them, so getting that story read to them was a good reinforcer in that situation. The next thing we want to do is decide an initial DRO interval. This is basically saying, how long does the child have to not be sucking their thumb before the parent resumes reading the story? There's usually going to be some kind of window after that behavior has occurred where we want to make sure that it's not going to reoccur before we deliver that reinforcement. So maybe the child has to stop sucking their thumb for 5 seconds before we resume the story. And we can decide the length of that interval based on our baseline rate of that problem behavior occurring. So if the problem behavior occurs fairly frequently, then maybe we're going to have a really short DRO interval, so only a couple of seconds. If the behavior is something that's very infrequent, then maybe we're going to have a much longer DRO interval. Maybe we could start with an interval of 30 minutes or even an hour before it would run into issues. It's a good idea to note here that this is for our initial DRO interval. This is our starting point. So it's based on the existing occurrence of that behavior. As time goes on and as we can reduce the frequency of that problem behavior, we can lengthen these DRO intervals to be more effective. So these procedures are going to be adaptive and they're going to change as the behavior adjusts. So step 4 is for us to actually start eliminating the reinforcer for the problem behavior and delivering the reinforcer for the absence of the problem behavior. So we're only going to deliver reinforcement if that problem behavior is not occurring. So with the child sucking their thumb, we stop reading the story if they start sucking their thumb, and we resume reading the story if they stop sucking their thumb. Number 5 here is the idea that we would reset our interval if the problem behavior does happen to occur. So if the child starts sucking their thumb, you stop delivering that reinforcement. And then we would start our interval of, say, 5 seconds that need to go by where they're not sucking their thumb before the reinforcer can be delivered again. If we made it to, say, 3 seconds in and then they started sucking their thumb again, then we would reset that interval back to 5 seconds and have to wait until they stop sucking their thumb again for those 5 seconds to elapse entirely. And as we said, we can gradually increase the interval length until the problem behavior is no longer occurring. And again, we see that there are 2 different types of DROs that we can talk about. We can have a whole interval DRO or a momentary DRO. A whole interval DRO is basically what we've been talking about so far, where the problem must be absent for the whole interval that we've defined in order for reinforcement to occur. We can talk about a different example and say, maybe look at disruptive behavior in a classroom. For a whole interval DRO, we could say that if a child goes 5 minutes without interrupting the class, they'll receive a small treat at the end of that 5-minute interval. But if they disrupt the class at any point, that 5-minute interval is going to reset and they don't get reinforcement. So if they act out in class, if they disrupt the class, then we reset our interval and we have to wait another 5 minutes. If they can then make it to the end of that next 5-minute interval, they would receive reinforcement and get their treat. In contrast, our momentary DRO procedure says only that the problem behavior should be absent at the end of the interval in order for them to receive reinforcement. So for that same 5-minute interval with disruptive behavior in class, we would say that the child could get a small treat if the problem behavior isn't actively happening at the 5-minute interval. So when the interval ends, if that behavior is not happening, they get their reinforcer. From a practical standpoint, the momentary DRO would be a lot easier to implement. Rather than having to monitor the whole interval, you could only monitor the end of the interval. But as you might expect, the momentary DRO is going to be a lot less effective at eliminating that problem behavior. So in a lot of research comparing the two options, whole interval DRO is overwhelmingly more effective at actually reducing disruptive behavior and other kinds of problem behaviors than the momentary DRO is. So the only real time that a momentary DRO is effective is after a whole interval DRO has already been successfully implemented. So we can use a momentary DRO to maintain a reduced amount of that behavior, but it's not really a good way to establish a reduction in that behavior. Next type of differential reinforcement is the differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, or DRA. And this is where the textbook starts. This is the first one the textbook covers, but I kind of like building up to this one. And so for a DRA, we're saying that we have a desired or replacement behavior being reinforced while an undesirable behavior is being extinguished. So instead of just wanting a reduction in our undesirable behavior, we want an increase or more occurrence of a specific desired behavior. So we have a specific replacement behavior that we want them to be doing instead of that undesirable behavior. The textbook uses an example here of a woman in a nursing home who would constantly complain. And so the idea was to try and get her to be more positive. So the idea would be to reinforce positive behavior and extinguish negative comments. So they wanted to shape positivity and to eliminate negativity. And so the nurses could do this by ignoring the negative comments. So if the woman was complaining, if she was saying all sorts of terrible things about the nursing home and the nurses, then the nurses would give her minimal attention for that behavior. But if she said something nice or said something positive, then they would give her attention. They would talk to her, they would interact with her more. And so our reinforcement here is that attention. And so our desirable behavior of positivity could be increased through the reinforcement of attention, and our undesirable behavior of negativity was extinguished through withholding attention. For other examples, we could say that a child's good table manners can be reinforced with praise and by giving them whatever they've asked for. So if they've requested food and they've asked with good manners, then you could pass them the thing that they've requested. So if they say, please pass the salt, you could pass them the salt. Bad table manners would be extinguished by ignoring those requests. If they just shouted, give salt, then you don't pass them the salt. And so we reinforce the good behaviors and extinguish the bad behaviors. We can see this also in putting your PIN into an ATM. Punching in the correct code is reinforced with actually getting your cash out, and punching the wrong numbers is going to be extinguished because you don't get your cash out of the machine. Same with typing the correct password. Putting in the correct password gets you into your device, and the incorrect password does not. And so on and so forth. There are so many different examples because this is a very effective method of increasing a desired behavior and decreasing an undesired behavior. So how do we actually use a DRA? Step one is, well, even before the step one that's listed here, you want to make sure that a DRA is actually going to work in this situation. And so for this to work, you're going to need a desirable behavior that is already occurring. You might have to start before using a DRA with something like shaping to get a particular desirable behavior to start occurring at all, because that desirable behavior needs to be present in order for it to be reinforced. So step one is kind of to make sure that you have the correct setup to use a DRA. Then we can go into our usual, where we want to define our target behaviors to both increase and decrease. What's our desirable behavior? What's our undesirable behavior? And again, setting these definitions allows us to differentiate between other things that might be going on. We want to know what specific behaviors we're looking for. And by having that specific definition, we can also sort of know to look for it and say monitor it if we wanted to judge our before and after rates of occurrence to see if a DRA was effective. Our next step is to identify the reinforcer for the problem behavior. We need to identify what's driving that problem behavior in order to put that behavior through extinction. So with our example of the woman in the nursing home, if attention was what was establishing and maintaining those negative comments and that negativity, then we want to remove the delivery of that reinforcer of attention when that problem behavior occurs. So we figure out what's driving the problem behavior, identify that reinforcer, and then we want to choose a reinforcer for the desirable behavior. What are we going to use to reinforce the behavior that we want to occur? And we're actually going to come back to this point and talk about choosing a reinforcer in just a little bit, so we'll leave it here for right now. But we can then start actually implementing our DRA. We want to start reinforcing the desirable behavior, and we want to deliver that reinforcement immediately and consistently. If you remember from all of our talk about reinforcement, it's going to be a lot better if reinforcement happens immediately so that they know what is cause for that reinforcement. They know which behavior led to them getting reinforcement. You want to do it consistently, so early on you're going to usually want a continuous schedule of reinforcement. Pretty much every time it occurs, every time that desirable behavior occurs, you're going to want to deliver reinforcement just to make it more and more likely for it to continue occurring. Once the desirable behavior is happening a lot more often, you can switch to a less intensive schedule of reinforcement. So you could switch to something like every 10th time the behavior occurs, or something like that, one of the intermittent schedules of reinforcement. But when we're just getting started, we want consistent reinforcement, and we want it to happen as immediately as possible. If necessary, to get this process started, you can prompt that desirable behavior. You can encourage the individual to engage in the desirable behavior. And you're usually going to want to prompt that good behavior before the undesirable behavior occurs, not after. Otherwise, they might view their undesirable behavior as a way to get you to prompt them to do the good behavior to then get reinforcement, so then they do the bad behavior more often. So you want the good behavior to be prompted before the bad behavior occurs. This prompting should also occur basically when the environment is set up for that behavior to occur. So you want the EO and the SD to be present. That would usually lead to the undesirable behavior, but you want to prompt them to do the desirable behavior before that undesirable behavior can occur. And if we're trying to get that desirable behavior to occur more often, the desirable behavior should require less effort than the undesirable behavior. You want to set it up so that it's easier for them to do the thing that you want them to do, and it's harder for them to do the thing you don't want them to do. And again, whenever possible. The next thing that we want to be doing is actually extinguishing or devaluing the reinforcer for the undesirable behavior, or behaviors if you're targeting multiple. If it isn't possible to separate out the reinforcer for that undesirable behavior, or if for whatever reason it isn't possible to extinguish that reinforcer for that undesirable behavior, then you might be better off using a DRL or a DRO. It just sort of depends on the given situation. And as I kind of already hinted at the end, once you've actually managed to reduce the problem behavior and increase the desirable behavior, you would want to start incorporating intermittent schedules of reinforcement for the desirable behavior so that the desirable behavior is itself more resistant to extinction and then doesn't require reinforcement every single time it happens. I already kind of stated this, but it's easiest to use a DRA if your desirable behavior already occurs occasionally, or if you can prompt it to occur. As I said before, otherwise you can use something like shaping to get it to happen, but it's easier to use the DRA if it's already happening or if it's something that could happen with prompting. And a really neat use of DRA that the textbook takes a moment to talk about is the idea of using a DRA to promote creativity or variability in responding. So if instead of reinforcing a specific set behavior, if you differentially reinforce something that hasn't been recently seen, or if you reinforce something that is completely novel, then you can see increases in the occurrence of things that you haven't seen before or haven't seen recently. So we can end up actually reinforcing the idea of variability or creativity so that you start seeing new responses that all kind of fall under the same umbrella. So the example the textbook uses is if a child is building a tower out of blocks. You can differentially reinforce creativity by giving the child attention whenever they build a new configuration of blocks, and by not giving them attention if they build something they've built previously. And if you do that, you start seeing more and more different combinations of blocks, and you'll see less and less repetition of things that they've built previously. So we've ended up in that situation promoting creativity, and we're seeing more variability in their actions. So just an interesting use of a DRA. So as promised, I want to circle back and talk about actually choosing a good reinforcer. So how do we identify a putative reinforcer, something that's going to be useful in this given situation? So the first thing is that you can use the same reinforcer that's maintaining the undesirable behavior. So in our example of the woman in the hospital, attention was what was maintaining the negative comments, so the nurses decided to use attention again to reinforce positive comments. So you can use the exact same behavior because it was already effective at maintaining the undesirable behavior, so it should continue to be effective in getting that new behavior or the more desirable behavior to occur more often. Another thing that we could do is actually just watch the individual that we're trying to get these behaviors to change in. Observe activities that they enjoy and things that are more likely to occur. So high probability things like a child playing video games or watching TV. If those are things they enjoy doing and will do whenever given the opportunity, those could be very useful reinforcers. So just by observing their activity, then you can identify potential reinforcers. You could go so far as to sit down and actually ask them questions. What do they like doing? What kinds of things do they enjoy? And you can pick reinforcers out of what they tell you they enjoy. You could conduct a preference assessment where you actually present them with different possible reinforcers and see which ones they choose out of the given options. And we're going to talk about different types of preference assessments on the next slide here. So we talked about observing, we talked about asking. For the testing, which is our number 4 here at the bottom, we have a couple of different types of preference assessments. The first being a single stimulus preference assessment, which is you have a bunch of possible reinforcers, a bunch of stimuli that you can present. You would present them one at a time and see which ones develop interest. So if you have a child whose behavior you would like to change, maybe give the child a toy. So if you have like 6 different toys that they might like, then present them one at a time. Do they like the first toy? It's a toy car. Do they show any interest? Okay, what about the next toy? It's an art set. Do they show any interest in that? So a single stimulus preference assessment looks at if they show any interest, if they interact with or seem to enjoy one stimulus or one possible reinforcer at a time. For our paired stimulus preference assessment, you would present 2 or a pair of stimuli at a time. So you would present the toy car and the art set at the same time and see which of the 2 the individual prefers. And if you wanted to do a thorough job of it, you could pair each of your possible stimuli. So if you have 6 options, then you have many, many possible pairs, but you want to look at, if given these 2 options, which one do they prefer, to test all of the possible combinations. So that can take quite a while. You can also do a multiple stimulus preference assessment, or MSWO, if you specifically use a variant where you don't replace items. But the base multiple stimulus preference assessment would be that you would present all 6 of your possible reinforcers and see which one the individual goes to first. If you're doing it without replacement, after they've made their first choice, you would remove that option and then present the remaining potential stimuli. So if you had 6 options and they choose the toy car first, then you would present the remaining 5 and see what is their second preference. What is the third? What is the fourth? Until you know the order of preference. And usually you're going to want to use the most preferred stimulus as a reinforcer. And it looks like I got ahead of myself, and I actually talked about each of these on the previous slide instead of waiting until I actually broke it down here, but everything I just said is on the next 2 slides in point form, so what I just went through applies here. We won't go over it again. I do want to take a moment and talk about the potential for a behavior being negatively reinforced. Most of what we've talked about so far has centered around positive reinforcement, so you can give attention to make a behavior more likely to occur, or you can give a food reward to make a behavior more likely to occur. But there are also situations where we see negative reinforcement, where the removal of an aversive stimulus makes a behavior more likely to occur. So what if our problem behavior is being negatively reinforced? So you might see this specific scenario called differential negative reinforcement of alternative behavior, or a DNRA. So the same basic idea as our DRA, but specifying that we're for sure using negative reinforcement in this situation. So the textbook talks about a particular scenario where a student, Jason, who has autism, has problems completing his coursework. So when the teacher asks Jason to do his work, Jason will slam on his desk and rock back and forth. And so the teacher will allow Jason to go to the back of the room and calm down. So he gets to be by himself and to specifically avoid doing the work that triggered this behavior. So the consequence is that Jason escapes from doing the schoolwork and gets to sit by himself, which he finds reinforcing. So our outcome in this scenario is that Jason is a lot more likely to engage in problem behavior when the teacher asks him to do schoolwork, because it leads to this desirable consequence of getting out of doing the schoolwork and getting to sit by himself. So our solution would be that we can actually use this negative reinforcer of escaping from schoolwork to reinforce schoolwork. In this scenario, we can give that reinforcer of getting a break whenever the schoolwork is completed. Oops, we don't need to move on quite yet. But if Jason, when asked to do his schoolwork, if he does this behavior, the teacher cannot allow that escape behavior. So if the teacher asks him to do work and he doesn't want to do it, so he slams on his desk and rocks back and forth. If the teacher makes him stay at the desk until he completes the question, then he doesn't get to escape the schoolwork for doing the undesirable behavior. If instead, when the teacher asks him to do his work, if he does one question, and then the teacher allows him to take a break and go sit by himself, then Jason's going to be more likely to do more work to be able to stop for a while and go sit by himself. And we can then use our intermittent reinforcement so that instead of after every question that Jason answers, he gets a break, maybe we get it up to every 2 questions or 5 questions or maybe even 10 questions until we get to an acceptable amount of work getting accomplished before he gets a break. So we can actually use negative reinforcement to encourage those desirable behaviors, and we can still extinguish bad behaviors that are being maintained by negative reinforcement. From the example of Jason's behavior, we can also focus on the slamming his hands on the desk portion of that behavior, and that would be a self-injurious behavior. Sometimes the stimulation that comes from engaging in self-injurious behavior, or SIBs, sometimes that action itself can be automatically reinforcing because they're receiving stimulation. So if you wanted to try and overcome that and really focus on the extinction of the self-injurious behavior, you could add an extra step to it. So instead of just offering Jason breaks from the academic tasks for, gaps in not exhibiting the problem behaviors, so if they don't do the desk slamming and rocking back and forth, you let them get a break from their work, you could also add an extra piece of giving attention for every X amount of time that they go without exhibiting that self-injurious behavior. So this is a combination of we're encouraging that decrease of the undesirable behavior, and this is we're considering it here separately from the encouragement to do the desirable behavior of actually getting the work done. So you can kind of break it down and focus on the 2 portions separately. Just a slight aside here to talk about other things we might want to consider while we're employing differential reinforcement. Oh my goodness, forgetting words today. For specific kinds of behaviors. There are also a couple of slight variants of our DRA, which you'll occasionally see in very specific scenarios. So we might see differential reinforcement of specifically incompatible behavior, so a DRI. This is when our alternative behavior is something that is specifically incompatible with our undesirable behavior. So our desirable behavior should be something that they cannot do the unwanted behavior at the same time as. So if the undesirable behavior is, say, using your hands to slap your desk, your alternative behavior might be something that involves their hands, something that is incompatible with slapping their desk. So maybe you give them a fidget toy, maybe you give them a Rubik's Cube, maybe you give them a pen and paper, something that would occupy their hands and be incompatible with that undesirable behavior. And because both the desirable and undesirable behavior are using the same kind of modality, increasing the rate of our desired behavior will also decrease the rate of our undesired behavior because they can't occur at the same time. So by default, having more of the behavior we want means that there's less time and less opportunity to do the behavior that we don't want them to do. We can also see what's called differential reinforcement of communication. So we would use, instead of having them do a behavior to get something like attention or usually attention, we would then encourage a communication response. So we would reinforce a communication response to replace the problematic behavior. So if the child throws a tantrum to get attention, if you teach them that asking for attention gets them attention and does so much more efficiently than throwing a tantrum, then they'll be a lot more likely to just ask for attention, and they'll be a lot less likely to do the undesirable behavior of throwing a temper tantrum. You'll sometimes see this called functional communication training, but it's the same basic process. So for some specifics of our DRC, for our communication focus, if they're looking for attention, so the child's problem behavior is being reinforced by attention, you teach them to ask for attention. So if you're in a classroom, you might get them to ask, "How am I doing?" So that the teacher comes over and takes a look at how they're doing and gives them feedback. And that's going to be more efficient than just acting out in class. This also works if the problem behavior is being reinforced by escape. So again, in a classroom setting, maybe they're escaping from a difficult academic task by not doing the task. If you teach them to ask for assistance, they can tell the teacher that they don't understand, then the teacher can actually give them assistance and they don't need to do the problem behaviors to escape from the task. Now they have help and the task is more manageable. So a couple of different ways you can employ these, and of course, these aren't the only ways you can use it. So for our summary at the end of the lecture, we can look at our three major categories. And like I said, our DRH is the equivalent of a DRL, just the opposite, so it gets all lumped together. For our DRL, we would use that when we want to decrease but not necessarily eliminate a particular problem behavior. So if we're aiming for a lower rate of behavior, we would usually go with a DRL. Our DRO is when we want to eliminate a specific problem behavior, we want an absence of that behavior, and we don't have any preferred other behavior that we want them to do instead. They can do anything except the problem behavior. And a DRA is when we want to increase the frequency of an existing desirable behavior and decrease or eliminate a problem behavior. So if we specifically have an alternative behavior, we would use a DRA. And that's the basics on how to discriminate when we should use each of these three options. And for our DRH, it's instead of decrease or eliminate, we would want to increase a behavior, so we would focus on higher rates of responding, but that's going to be a lot less likely. As part of our wrap-up, some things to just keep in mind is that you should remember that our behaviors exist because they are being reinforced. So problem behaviors usually always exist because of some kind of reinforcement, whether it's from attention, whether it's self-reinforcing, whatever. There is something that's maintaining that particular behavior. Extinction and or punishment on their own is often insufficient unless we have some kind of differential reinforcement training. There should be the encouragement to do something else. Extinction or punishment alone isn't going to cut it in most scenarios. And so our differential reinforcement focuses on the desirable behavior. What is it that we want them to be doing instead? We can have a specific alternative behavior, or we might have the idea of anything else, but we do have something that we want them to be doing instead. So if we're decreasing a behavior, some new behavior should take its place, whether it's a specific behavior that we want to encourage, or if we want them to do literally anything else, we can set that up based on how we set up our differential reinforcement. And we should keep in mind that extinction and punishment do not teach new behaviors, they only decrease the current ones. And that's why reinforcement of other behaviors is important, because we want to shift that attention from the undesirable behaviors to whatever our desirable behavior is.